11:30 a.m. December 22nd, 1944. Private First Class Leo Palmer hunched in a frozen foxhole south of Bastogne, Belgium, watching 4 Germans pick their way through the snow with white flags lifted against a sky the color of gunmetal. It was 20 degrees below zero. His fingers, deadened stumps inside thin gloves, could hardly hold the Browning automatic rifle. Every breath put needles of ice in his nose. 48 hours in that slit of earth with no hot food, no winter gear worth the name, no promise of help. The men coming toward him wore long wool coats and mirror-bright boots. They looked warm, they looked fed, they looked sure. Palmer knew what they'd come for. Surrender. The senior officer called himself Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps. The junior, Lieutenant Helmut Henke of Panzerlehr's Operations Section, hugged a briefcase like a life preserver. Inside lay a typed ultimatum granting 2 hours to capitulate or face total annihilation. They had reason to be confident. Around Bastogne, the German vise had snapped shut. 5 divisions pressing 1. The 101st Airborne surrounded, outgunned, short of tanks, short of ammunition, short of everything that mattered. For 6 days the weather had smothered the sky. No fighters, no transports, no mercy. And yet the one thing they did not know was the name of the American in charge inside that ring of steel, a 46-year-old artilleryman, Anthony McAuliffe, who kept the word surrender out of his vocabulary as carefully as a live grenade out of his lap. In the next 17 minutes he would answer with a single syllable that ricocheted through history, stiffened a starving garrison, baffled the enemy, and helped turn the hinge on Hitler's last throw of the dice in the West. 6 days earlier, on December 16th, 200,000 German troops with 1,000 tanks had smashed through the American line in the Ardennes. Hitler's final gamble. Split the Allied front, seize Antwerp, force a separate peace. He scraped together every veteran regiment he could tear from the east, every running tank and assault gun, every boy of 16 and man of 50 who could carry a rifle. Columns moved by night in radio silence. Horses dragging guns through the trees, the Wehrmacht massing 3 armies opposite the thinnest part of the line. They achieved what professionals call operational surprise, and then tactical surprise on top of it. Intelligence missed the buildup. Ultra went quiet. Reconnaissance planes saw only clouds. Patrols reported trouble and were told they were jumpy. The units holding the Ardennes were green or exhausted, learning war or trying to escape it. When the blow fell, it broke bones. Speed was everything. The Germans needed the road nets before the Allies could pivot. Bastogne was one of those knots. 7 roads converging on a market town, whose name most Americans couldn't pronounce, but whose possession would govern the southern Ardennes. Without it, the German offensive would bog in snow and logistics. With it, their spearheads could knife toward Antwerp. Eisenhower saw the danger on the 17th and ordered the 101st to move from its rest area near Reims to Bastogne. They'd just come off 3 months in Holland with Market Garden. Casualties had been heavy. Many men were on leave. The division commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington. His deputy was in England. That left Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, an artilleryman, a 1918 West Pointer, whose life until then had been measured in mills and firing tables, suddenly in charge of a battered Airborne Division in the largest battle of the Western Front. They rolled out on the 18th, 100+ miles of misery in open trucks through sleet and darkness. Men stood packed shoulder to shoulder, too cramped to sit, jumping off while moving to relieve themselves and sprinting to clamber back in. Engines coughed and died. Axles skated off icy shoulders. They passed units streaming the other way, ghost-eyed soldiers muttering about tigers and panthers and whole divisions bearing down. The paratroopers kept going. They came without winter gear because this was supposed to be quick. A few days to plug a hole, hand over, go back to hot coffee. Many had field jackets and summer shirts, jump boots that turned to iron, gloves that might as well have been paper. They stuffed newspapers under blouses, wrapped sacks around their feet, lied to each other about the cold. A corporal shared a chocolate bar he'd been saving for Christmas, breaking it with teeth he could not feel. A private wrote his mother's address on a scrap of cardboard and tucked it into his boot, because boots get found. By the 20th, the noose closed. Every road was cut. The 101st Combat Command B of the 10th Armored, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and strays from shattered outfits were sealed inside the perimeter. 14,000 Americans penned in a town of 8,000, with 5 enemy divisions pressing in, Panzerlehr, 2nd Panzer, 26th Volksgrenadier, and more in pieces. The Germans had tanks, ammunition, artillery, and time. The Americans had grit. Losses came like hammer strokes. On the 19th, Lieutenant Colonel James Leprade of the 506th PIR died when an 88 punched through his headquarters at Noville. The division medics, thinking they were safe, set up an aid station and were taken whole when German patrols slipped through a seam. More than 100 medical personnel gone in a gulp. Surgeons, drivers, the fragile thread between wounding and living. The chaplain who had blessed the station that morning stood in an empty doorway by afternoon, his hands open to nothing. The weather fought on the German side. Nights plunged toward -28. Rifle bolts froze. Machine guns had to be worked like living things to keep them from locking solid. Medics thawed morphine ampules in their mouths. Blood plasma became amber glass before it could save anyone. Men urinated on actions to warm them, kept one round chambered because they might not be able to work the bolt. Frostbite harvested more limbs than bullets. Boots were slit open to spare gangrene. Aid stations filled with black toes, gray fingers, the sweet sick smell of rot. In cellars under shattered roofs, civilians breathed steam in tight bundles. 50 souls to a room, hushing babies through the howl of Nebelwerfers that rose like banshees before impact. A baker who had not seen flour in days whispered prayers over men he did not know. A schoolteacher kept a tally of names on the chalkboard until the chalk wore down to a pinch of dust. In the square, a toppled Christmas tree lay half buried in rubble, tinsel caught like frost on broken branches. By dawn on the 22nd, Bastogne was running on the fumes of courage. Artillery batteries counted their shells, 10 per gun in some places. Rifle companies whispered they had enough cartridges for one, maybe two hard fights. Food was a rumor. Most were on 1/3 rations, chewing frozen K rations and melted snow. Morphine was rationed. Bandages were boiled and reused. Men lay on pews and classroom floors because stretchers were gone, and blankets were a luxury. McAuliffe knew. He drove the lines every day, jeep slipping on ice, plaster dust trickling down in the barracks when a near miss shook the foundation. He saw teenagers hobbling on swollen feet, and sergeants awake on courage alone. Lieutenants in charge of companies because captains were dead. He saw what they carried and what they lacked, and he knew time was sand running out. So when the 4 Germans stepped out of the trees at 11:30 with bedsheet blindfolds folded in their pockets, Palmer froze, and Staff Sergeant Carl Dickinson moved. He waved them in, listened while the younger officer, perfect English, said they carried a message and would consent to being blindfolded. PFC Ernest Prewich, a medic who spoke German, helped wind the cloth over their eyes and led them by a wandering path through American lines. The visitors could hear what they could not see, tired voices that hadn't cracked, the clack of bolts, the brusque syllables of sergeants who still sounded like men with jobs to do. No one sounded beaten. Somewhere along the route, a chaplain's voice rose over the rumble of distant guns, finishing a prayer with Amen, just as an 88 thumped and dust sifted from beams. A stray dog, skinny ash gray, wove through legs, then vanished into a drift. The note climbed the chain, First Sergeant Constantine Pappas to Captain James Adams, to battalion at Marvey, to Colonel Joseph Harper's regimental HQ, to division. At 11:45, it reached McAuliffe in a stone-cold basement of the Heinz barracks. Maps tacked to walls under kerosene light, radios hissing, clerks in sweaters scribbling with stiff fingers because the power had died 2 days ago. Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore shook the general awake. The Germans sent a surrender demand. McAuliffe sat up, hair mussed, eyes dry and red, and said, "Surrender? Oh, nuts." He read the typed sheets, English and German. Diacriticals filled in by hand, predicting doom from units now in German hands, promising a great bombardment by an artillery corps, and 6 heavy flak battalions if the terms were refused. He crumpled the letter, bounced it into a wastebasket, and went out to congratulate the men who'd just knocked down a roadblock. Protocol, however, has a stubborn personality. Flags of truce want answers. When he returned, the staff argued drafts. A formal reply explaining why surrender was impossible, a bluff about relief closing from the south. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the G3, cut through it. "Sir," he said, "what you said first is hard to beat." McAuliffe frowned. "What do you mean?" "You said nuts." Heads around the table nodded. McAuliffe grinned, took a scrap of paper and wrote, "To the German commander, nuts." The American commander, a clerk typed it, hands shaking from cold and a touch of awe. Colonel Harper took the page and Prewich the interpreter, and went to the foxhole where the blindfolded Germans waited in the trees. Harper pressed the message into Major Wagner's gloved hand. Henke asked whether the reply was written or verbal. Written, he asked if it was affirmative. Harper said, "The reply is one word, nuts." Henke blinked, puzzled. "Is that negative or affirmative?" "Decidedly not affirmative," Harper said, and let his voice go hard. "If you continue this foolish attack, your losses will be tremendous." Back at the Kessler farm. Blindfolds off, the Germans opened the page and stared at a piece of American slang that made as much sense as a snowstorm in July. Harper, considering helpful translations, muttered, "Tell them to take a flying..." Prewitt squared himself and gave the precise German, the one that needed no dictionary. "You can go to hell." Faces tightened. "We will kill many Americans," Henke answered. "This is war. We will kill many Germans," Harper said evenly. "On your way, and good luck to you." When Wagner walked past Palmer's hole, he flicked the blindfold into the air. Palmer caught it, used it later to wipe down his gun, and tossed away a souvenir that would one day sit behind glass. The Germans reported up the line. To Regimental HQ. To Panzer Lehr's command post, where General Heinrich von Lüttwitz of X-Sueven Panzer Corps happened to be visiting. He was stunned. He had prepared to accept an American surrender and to parade into Bastogne behind white flags. Instead, a single word he did not understand. General Fritz Bayerlein of Panzer Lehr said it was time to start the promised barrage. Lüttwitz, embarrassed, admitted the heavy guns weren't there. They'd moved forward to push on toward the Meuse. The 6 heavy flak battalions in the letter were bluff. Called on it, the sky stayed quiet. In a nearby dugout, a German tank commander warmed his hands over a stove and listened to the rumor pass man to man. Americans said something crazy, something small, and felt a discomfort that wasn't the cold. In the rear, a young clerk penciled nuts, with a question mark in the margin of his log, and the mark looked more like a crack than a note. Word of nuts rippled through the American lines at the speed of rumor. Men who had been chewing despair suddenly chewed something else. If the general could laugh at a threat like that, maybe it wasn't the end. If the man at the center could tell the enemy to take his 2 hours and stuff them, then the men in the holes could hold another day. A radio operator with cracked lips keyed the word to a buddy on another frequency, then grinned into the static as if he'd smuggled a joke across enemy lines. A mortar crew chalked nuts in shaky block letters on a shell and sent it downrange, laughing for the first time in days. The story grew tales as stories do. Some said he tore the letter to confetti. Some swore he had used saltier words. Vincent Vicari, McAuliffe's aide, would later set it straight. Nuts was exactly his style. The strongest word a gentleman who did not swear would use, and it was enough. The psychological tide turned. German troops had been told Bastogne would fold by the 22nd. Every day lost cost momentum. Every hour of delay dragged their timetable closer to clear skies and American air power. What kind of enemy laughs when surrounded? Doubt is frostbite for morale. Nuts worked like exposure. Field Marshal Hasso von Manteuffel heard the answer and raged. He needed Bastogne taken. He needed the Meuse by Christmas. Instead, he had a siege and a word. On some fronts, commanders deploy artillery. On others, a sentence detonates. On the 23rd, the sky opened like a curtain. Sunlight cut the cold. C-47s droned overhead and parachutes blossomed. Medical chests, ammunition, ration bundles, overshoes, gloves, hope in canvas sleeves. 241 planes dropped 144 tons. Not enough to fatten men or fill every limber, but enough to keep the guns talking. P-47 slid in behind, hunched on the horizon, and went to work on roads and columns and anything that moved. Men on the ground watched bundles thump into snow, tore them open with numb fingers, whooped at the miracle of socks and sulfa powder and 30 cal belts. Combat medics sank onto a crate, wept once, hard, then got back up and went to work. In Chaplin's corners, candles flickered against whitewashed walls, and someone passed around a paper cup of cocoa that tasted like a holiday remembered. A private unfolded a letter from home that had arrived in a parachute canister. We hung a star in the window, his mother had written, and he tucked the page near his heart as insulation against more than the cold. In the field adjacent to the drop zone, a glider pilot who had walked out of Holland in September stood with a cigarette cupped in both hands and counted the chutes, whispering numbers as if his breath could keep them from drifting too far. In town, a Belgian boy of 12 ran toward a Red Cross-marked bundle, skidded, and was gently spun back by a paratrooper who said, "Easy, kid." First, the wounded. The boy nodded and stood guard over the crate like a knight. On Christmas Eve, with bombs thumping outside and plaster dust whispering down, McAuliffe pecked at a battered typewriter and dictated a message by candlelight. He told his men about the demand and the reply. "What's merry about all this, you ask? We're fighting. It's cold. We aren't home." Then he listed the divisions they'd stopped in every direction, reminded them of what they had already given their country, and closed with the only gift that mattered, defiance wrapped around duty. Mimeographs clicked. Company commanders read the words in cellars and foxholes. Some men cheered. Some cried. All of them felt taller. In the town square, under a tree blasted bare, a trooper hummed a carol through chattering teeth, and another joined him until the tune carried just enough to make a few men smile. In a cellar, a medic lit a candle, held a hand, and called the flicker a star. The Germans answered that night with their hardest push. Panzer Lehr's veterans drove in from the west. 15th Panzer Grenadiers shoved from the southeast. 26th Volksgrenadiers pressed from the northeast. At Champs, Team Cherry of the 10th Armored stood with 4 tank destroyers and 2 companies of paratroopers against 18 tanks, shouldering through the dark. They held their fire until 300 yards, then lit the night, one panzer after another blooming into orange. The line bent but did not break. Near Mandat Saint-Étienne, the 327th Glider Infantry felt the knife point of German paratroopers, seasoned men who moved through the woods like rumor. They were on top of the positions before some Americans knew they were there. Rifles jammed, entrenching tools swung. Private Thomas Gallagher cracked 3 skulls with his shovel and lived to be surprised about it. The glider men held by inches. The worst came near Flamierge, where tanks and infantry found a seam and poured through toward town. McAuliffe scraped the bottom of the barrel and found a barrel's worth. Cooks, clerks, walking wounded. Bandaged men led by Major Bill Desabry with one eye under gauze, who refused evacuation and took this scratch force into the trees. They stopped the Germans long enough for reinforcements to bite. When dawn paled the branches, 42 German bodies lay in the snow. 18 Americans of the Provisional Company did not stand up, but Bastogne still did. Beyond the lines, the weather's turn changed other maps. At an airfield in France, crew chiefs slapped frost from aluminum skins and yelled over engines. Loadmasters checked lashings on crates of plasma and 50 cal ammunition. Pilots traced routes over flak-marked charts. In a different tent, Patton studied the situation with the impatience of a man who believed speed was a tactic all its own. He had turned a Third Army like a longship in a narrow channel and driven it north through sleet. And he knew the moment Bastogne got a slit of sky, he could punch through. Inside Bastogne, the days blurred to the color of snow and smoke. Between bombardments, men slept in slices. A minute here, 5 there, with mouths open, lips cracked white. A platoon runner learned to carry 2 messages at once, because there might not be a second trip. A radio man played a game with himself. If the next shell lands closer than the last, I'll count to 10 and breathe. If farther, I'll count to 5 and breathe. Sergeant taught a private how to nap with his boots on, and his rifle tucked under his armpit like a child. In a schoolhouse-turned-aid station, a Belgian nurse learned the English words hold and hurts and brave, and used all 3 often. At a crossroads west of town, a squad waited in bones of hedgerow, their breath fogging in unison like a single beast. The man on the bar, Palmer's friend from training, a joker out of Missouri who hadn't joked in a week, whispered, "We'll talk about this when we're old and nobody will believe it." Palmer, who had never planned to be old in the first place, found that he wanted to be. The squad leader, a man with 2 kids and a third he had not yet met, set his watch by the rhythm of artillery and counted the gaps. After one long gap, he said, "Eyes up," and seconds later the German probing party appeared as if conjured by breath. On Christmas night, a German patrol crept near a farmhouse where civilians hid in a root cellar. The farmer's teen son held the handle against the shaking door, while his little sister pressed her hands over her own mouth to stop a sob. Above them, an American sentry. His name was Reuben. He used to fix radios in Ohio, heard the scrape, waited until the dark shapes were almost past, and then coughed. A single deliberate sound to pull them toward the kill zone where 2 other rifles waited. Later, the farmer brought Reuben a jar of pickled onions saved from autumn, and the 2 men tried to invent a language from smiles and nods. In the German lines, sleep went thin as ration bread. A Stug commander who had driven from Kursk to Normandy and back again with luck in his pocket tried to draw up a map from rumor, and found only fog. A grenadier pulled a scarf up over chapped lips, and imagined his mother's kitchen in Cologne. Then he pushed the picture away because the air wavered with aircraft again, and the mind can't live in 2 seasons at once. Officers covered their uncertainty with orders. The timetable hung around their necks like a clock tied to a swimmer. On December 26th, The lead tanks of the 4th Armored Division carved a corridor to the town. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams drove the spear. Captain William Dwight rolled the first Shermans in and found McAuliffe. "How are you, General?" he asked. "Gee, I'm mighty glad to see you," McAuliffe said, with the same plainness that had minted a legend. A tank crewman jumped down and handed a paratrooper a pack of cigarettes as if it were a medal. Somewhere a man laughed so hard he scared himself. The siege broke. Patton arrived 4 days later and pinned a Distinguished Service Cross on McAuliffe's chest. The general deflected the light onto others. The paratroopers who held the ring, the artillerymen who made every shell count, the medics who cut without anesthetic and prayed the patient would pass out. A word means nothing without men who will live inside it. The days after relief were not quiet. The Bulge was still a brawl, but the hinge had swung. Reporters flooded Bastogne. Headlines at home shouted a slang reply that needed no glossary. Radio men retold it until it felt like family lore. Letters piled up. Mothers thanking him for giving their sons something to believe in. School children scrawling cartoons of a big no on a tiny piece of paper. The story outlived the battle. Marines joked about giving the enemy the Bastogne treatment at the Chosin Reservoir. Fire bases in Vietnam posted nuts on bunker walls. The word became shorthand for standing when you have every reason to kneel. In distant wars and farther deserts, a squad would stencil the word on plywood and suddenly feel connected to the cold and the courage of a town in Belgium. A National Guardsman in a dust-swirled outpost drew it, with a marker on the inside of his helmet, and tapped the letters with a gloved finger before stepping. Outside the wire, McAuliffe wore a second star on January 3, 1945, and later commanded 7th Army and U.S. Army Europe. He retired a full general in 1956. But the nickname stuck like frost, the Nuts General. He was a man given to clear lines and short sentences. In photographs from later years, there's a hint of surprise in his smile, as if he never quite understood why a single word, chosen because it was his habit, had followed him like a drumbeat. Bastogne remembered too. The square took his name. A Sherman with battle scars sits there like a stony sentinel. Each December, the town gathers. School children lay wreaths, and old men whose friends never came home say the word again. Softly, like a prayer and a laugh together. In the War Museum, a typewriter rests behind glass. Carriage frozen mid-line, and visitors lean in as if a ghost might finish the sentence. The officers around that basement table went on. Harry Kinnard to pioneer air cavalry in Vietnam. Joe Harper to command the infantry school. Ernest Previch to a life spent studying the sea. Each December 22nd, he remembered telling German officers, in good German, to go to hell. The veterans of the siege formed the battered bastards of Bastogne, wearing the enemy's insult as a badge. At reunions, their numbers thinned and their stories grew brighter. Someone always raised a glass and said it. Everyone smiled. Staff Sergeant Joe Rogan, down to a handful of cartridges and a pocket of strength, remembered the word arriving like a hand on his shoulder. Private William Sarkanis, bleeding on the stone floor of St. Pierre's under shattered stained glass, smiled through pain. "That's our general." Technical Sergeant Don Burgett said fear never left, but it shrank to a size a man could carry. Vincent Speranza, chipping ice from a machine gun barrel, laughed for the first time in days. Decades later, the memory would still make his voice shake. Corporal Walter Gordon, wounded and exhausted, cheered because if someone up there could answer like that, then someone up there was still leading. A medic named Rose, who had not slept more than an hour at a stretch for 5 days, taped a note to the wall that said nuts and found herself glancing at it between patience like a totem. German commanders studied the siege after the war and admitted what they had felt that day but could not show. The reply pried loose something inside their men. It made them hesitate, and hesitation in combat is a wound that bleeds seconds. General Heinz Kokot wrote about the difficulty of attacking into laughter. Field officers talked around the word in memoirs. An unmilitary response, one called it, and you could hear the respect bubbling under the condescension like spring water under ice. The Bulge fought on for a month, but the initiative had already slipped. By late January, the Germans were back where they started. 100,000 casualties poorer, the Western Front's last spasm over. 4 months later, the war in Europe ended. After the guns fell quiet, Palmer went home with a scar he would not talk about, and a habit of checking doorways that took years to break. He married the girl who had mailed him a knitted scarf that arrived too late to help. For a decade, he kept a box under his bed with a K-ration spoon, a photograph of a snow-choked lane, and a folded scrap of white cloth that had cleaned a Browning and once covered a German's eyes. He only opened the box on winter nights when the wind sounded like distant rockets. He told his son the story when the boy turned 18, and the boy listened carefully, the way a man listens when he suspects he will be called to his own hard hour someday. In Bastogne, the children of those who had crouched in cellars now taught school. December meant wreaths and sashes and lessons on a word that didn't translate cleanly into French or Walloon, but carried just fine in the face and hands. They tended graves at the cemetery, reading names aloud so the syllables would not drift into forgetfulness. A girl placed a pine cone on a stone and told her brother, "This one gave us Christmas," and the boy, grave with the seriousness children can summon, nodded. Decades passed and the story kept finding new mouths. A reenactor in a borrowed uniform tried the word on for size, and found that it didn't feel like acting so much as borrowing courage. A historian moved a finger along a battle map and said, "Here," and the students looked up because the voice had changed. A pilot, gray now, walked past the museum case and stopped when he saw the typewriter. He didn't cry. War had already taken the easy tears, but he did take off his cap and hold it in two hands for a long time. Numbers tell part of it. From December 19th to January 6th, the 101st recorded 341 killed, 1691 wounded, 516 missing. Other units bled at the same rate. They denied the crossroads the enemy needed, bought time for Patton's tanks, held long enough for the weather to break and the sky to fill. The rest lives beyond arithmetic. Bastogne is the measure of what ordinary people find when they are scraped down to the core. It is the proof that leadership can turn despair into iron. It is the reminder that wars are not won by material alone, but by a refusal that is older than strategy. In foxholes and basements and wind-scoured fields, the will to say no becomes a weapon none can confiscate. There are theories about why the word worked. Some say it was the humor, defiance wrapped in a joke, the opposite of the grandiose language of ultimatums. Some say it was the shortness, one syllable you could carry like a charm. Some say it was the way it fit the speaker, a decent man reaching instinctively for the strongest thing he could say without becoming something he was not. Maybe all of it is true. Maybe the truth is simpler. Men in holes needed a sentence small enough to fit in their mouths, one they could repeat in the cold. They needed to hear their general talk like a man with his feet on the same frozen ground. Long after, in another winter, a young lieutenant at a training range told his platoon the story as they huddled in sleet, waiting out a pause between blank volleys. He didn't dramatize it, just said the word once and shrugged. The laughter was small, but it moved down the line and backs straightened under rucksacks because endurance enjoys company. Across the world, men and women in uniforms of different cuts and colors have kept their own words for defiance, but they all understand that one word did not win a war, but one word said at the hinge of an hour made men square their shoulders and say, "Not today." It showed that citizen soldiers far from home could answer history in the plain language of home. It showed that an enemy's weight can be met by a spine. It showed that the moral factors Clausewitz wrote about are not abstractions, but live ammunition. 4 letters dropped like a shell in a quiet room shaped a battle. A century from now, when the last eyewitness has fallen silent, the story will still travel because it is not about dates and maps as much as it is about a human answer to fear. The Germans demanded surrender. McAuliffe answered nuts. The line held. The timetable broke. The offensive failed. History bent. Not through polish or policy, not through careful staff work or a diplomatic phrase, but through the instinct of a commander who had walked the line and knew his men would rather die in place than live on their knees. In that basement, with plaster sifting down and the maps curling at the edges, he found the right word. It still hangs in the cold air of December like a bell note that never quite fades, proof that freedom is guarded not only by weapons, but by will, not only by plans, but by spirit, not only by logic, but by a stubborn heartbeat that rejects the easy answer when the easy answer is wrong. That is why the town still speaks his name each winter. That is why veterans raise a glass and grin. That is why a blindfold tossed into a foxhole became, for a moment, a relic. That is why when the snow returns and the wind cuts clean, the word comes back as if on cue. Nuts. That's why we remember. That's what we raise a glass to each winter. That is the best of us, inside the worst of times.